Now, it's day 2 of the World Economic Forum in Cape Town. We've been bringing you updates throughout the day. Of course, meetings are held on various issues, and it's a great networking opportunity as well for business people to mingle with government personnel. And let's cross live to Nompumelelo Siziba, who's at the World Economic Forum.
Thanks very much, Francis. Like you say, we are at the World Economic Forum here in Cape Town, and we're speaking to many different people who preside over many different industries. The discussion here really is about development. How does Africa forge ahead so that it can grow and develop and cater for a growing population? It is expected that the African population will double from now up to about 2050 to 2.4 billion people. So a lot of growth in terms of population, and there needs to be infrastructure and growth and development for that. Well, joining me now in our studio is Sipho Pityana. He's the chairman of Anglo Gold Ashanti and other companies, but we'll just stick with that particular one, and he's here in attendance. Thanks very much, sir, for joining us.
Good afternoon, Bumi, to you and your viewers.
Super. So how impactful are these gatherings for you as business, particularly as some may view it as a talk shop?
Well, it's an important talk shop because it exposes you to what you might think is a very peculiar, specific set of difficulties in your own environment and opportunities. You suddenly realize that it's something that affects others too, and as solutions are reflected upon, it's a sharing platform. It offers opportunities for cooperation and collaboration. It is not resolutions driven, but it is certainly ideas driven. There is a great appreciation, for instance, now that technology is upon us. It's quite disruptive. It has negative consequences, but the good thing is that the great focus is on the positive consequences that it might have and how it might help us drive growth in our economies.
So 50-odd countries have signed up for the African Continental Free Trade Area. And it's a very ambitious plan. They're hoping that it will get started by around July next year. But in your view, from a trade perspective, what do you see as the impediments that we have in making that very fluid and possible? And what work needs to be done in the interim?
Well, let me say this, that in the first instance, this is the most catalytic intervention that the African Union has made to drive development, short of continuing with perpetual dependency on others. Intra-Africa trade is going to be the key thing, because in most other regions, as in Europe and in North America and so on, and even in Latin America, there is more trade within than trade with other countries, with other economies. So we buy from other economies before we think of buying from our own, and expect others to buy our goods and services. So we need to be taking advantage of that. But what it implies is that we need to think Pan-African, we need to be Pan-African, and we need to understand that our countries are actually too small to carry weight and be able to penetrate international markets. What this offers is an opportunity. So the obstacles still are around restrictions in movements of those goods, restrictions in movements of people, and restrictions in movement of capital. So those are the three critical elements. We have to do detailed work around that. To drive that, we need to collaborate. So not all of us will be able to beneficiate our minerals in the same place. It may be that countries that produce gold must agree that if we mine gold in West Africa, we must beneficiate it in one country, platinum in another, iron ore in another.
Yes.
So manufacturing must not be driven by nationalistic sentiments, but by a Pan-Africanist approach. The same thing with skills. We have a huge shortage of skills. I mean, the high-end skills in most economies constitute 24% on average of the working population. In Africa, it constitutes 6%. So it means that if we were to access this new technology and drive development and growth of our economies, we need to increase our skills levels. So we need to be smart about that. We don't have time to invest in huge infrastructure, building universities and centers of technology. So we need to share that infrastructure as as Africans, which means we must look at opportunities that come with online learning,
Yes.
virtual universities which are accessible across the board, specializing in various areas. So those are the kinds of things that we need to be looking at if we're going to fast track this.
Yeah.
But we
So-
also need to ensure that we have access to skills across the African continent, including Africans in the diaspora.
It would be great, the whole online learning, the digital learning, but of course we need our people across the continent to have access to that, and
Yeah.
not many people do.
Well, the thing about online learning is that you can learn from any university. You can register at the University of Harvard or Oxford or university in Japan and in China,
Yes.
and have access to high-end tutoring that comes with being in those institutions. But also, you can have access to universities within the countries or within the continent that are specializing and provide better programs
Yes.
than those in the West and developed economies. So the important thing, though, is that we need to recognize that the old approach of thinking that before you can teach anything, you need to lay out this huge infrastructure of building a university and so on, is not going to get us there as quickly as we need to do.
Yes.
So we need to find more innovative ways to develop skills and do so very fast. Because the point about skills is that where we don't have an ability to develop the technologies today, we can access those technologies because we have people who can adapt to those technologies and bring that knowledge here and enable building on those and innovation to take place as well.
Yes. As I mentioned in the introduction, I'm talking to you with your mining hat on. You're the chairman of Anglo Gold Ashanti. How is digital technology changing the face of mining, do you think, across the continent, even within your own firm? And what about the concerns for people that they're losing their jobs because they're being taken over by robots or machines?
Well, I don't think that, certainly in mining, it's inconceivable today that technology is likely to take over. But it may serve as a benefit. We are a company, for instance, that is very concerned about improving and increasing safety levels in mining. In South Africa, we are operating at very deep levels. In fact, there is a lot more gold that is left behind in our underground, including in mines that have been mined and closed.
Yes.
That's because it's not safe to access those. So deployment of technology will improve access to those and accessing them in a safe manner. So that applies to other commodities as well. So technologies, I went and saw a new zinc smelter in Northern Cape that was launched by Vedanta. It's mainly driven by technology. So that's where mining is going. It does require that we need to invest more in training of our mine workers so that they are able to use those technologies and
Yes.
so on. So technology is here to stay. We need to invest in improving the ability of our people to use it and to benefit from it. It will change lifestyles, it will change the ways of working. It may mean that people are working shorter hours than they are working today. They have more leisure time, they have more quality of time with their families and so on. But it doesn't necessarily have to result in high levels of unemployment.
Yeah.
But it should help improve lifestyles and improve the growth of the economies.
You know, one of the concerns that I have is that mining obviously is very labor intensive.
Yeah.
And so people who may lose their jobs in the field, unless they're of a sort of higher level within their working environment, they could actually be left behind simply because maybe the new skills that they need to get to, they don't have the foundation to be able to grasp that and get to the next level.
Well, the curious thing,
how do you deal with those type of
the
people?
curious thing, Bumi, is that in fact you are thinking about mining impacting lower end skills.
Yes.
In fact, the new fourth industrial revolution is likely to impact white collar workers, people in banking, people in more professional categories of bookkeeping and legal, because artificial intelligence-driven interventions are going to process a lot of those through technologies. And that's one of the reasons why you see currently in banking in South Africa and in others, the more adoption and the accelerated adoption of technologies, because they are trying to keep up with where the world is at, because financial services is one of our major selling points. So the changing and the fast changing nature of those jobs is incredible. You probably hardly go to your branch to do banking. You use the ATM, or you use cell phone banking, or you use online banking.
Yeah.
What does that mean for jobs of those who were in those banks? So clearly, the 4IR is likely to impact more white-collar workers than blue-collar workers.
You know, you've been one of the very vocal business voices around corruption.
Yes.
You know, you've had a lot to say around state capture and so on. And corruption is not something that's just a South African concept. Yeah. It's the world over, but I guess some places have better checks and balances. Yeah. But on the African continent, it really has robbed us in terms of development and growth. So surely that's an area that our leaders really need to work on, not just our leaders, but business as well, because, you know, the private sector and the public sector together, you know, get involved in things that they shouldn't.
Absolutely. And business, by the way, has to lead the charge here, because part of the, and this was one of my contributions and in one of the panels, and this afternoon in a similar panel with President Museveni and the President of Ethiopia, is to make the point about how much business corruption actually contributes in instability, absence of peace and wars. And even in post-conflict environments, businesses are seen as having sided with a government that may have been corrupt and they may have been involved there. So we lose an opportunity of being a catalyst to sustainable peace on the continent if we act in corrupt ways. So this is an engagement that business has to follow through
yes.
across the board. Corruption on the African continent and business corruption on the African continent is not just by African businesses. It's actually, in most instances, as we've seen in South Africa, it is a global project.
Yes.
So it would be naive to think that Africa is corrupt, the rest of the world isn't, even when we talk about business. So we need to connect to international anti-corruption platforms.
Yes.
And part of the conversations that we've been having here under Apache, which is part of the World Economic Forum, that's a project that is focusing
yes.
on how we prevent corruption, money laundering, and all of that,
that's
and
right.
developing regulatory frameworks, is looking at how do we leverage technologies to improve effective programs that are against corruption, are about combating corruption, etc., etc. So it's a very critical part of what we are engaged in.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much for your time. That was Sipho Pityana. He's the chairperson of Anglo Gold Ashanti. And of course, the reason why we talk about corruption is that when people are taking kickbacks and bribes and so on, it takes away from properly valuing goods and services. And it means that we, as the general public, we're paying more, we're being robbed, and it just basically means it makes our quality of life that much worse. And of course, for the poorer people in our societies, it's obviously not fair at all. So corruption is negative for us because it means that we pay that much more for everything that we're supposed to consume, and it means a few people enjoy the benefits, swanning off around the world, having a good time at our expense. So that's the reason we talk about corruption. It's over to you, Francis.